The monitors had flatlined. The doctors stepped back. In the most expensive private room in St. Catherine's Hospital, Diane Whitfield was on her knees beside her 8-year-old son's bed, clutching his small, motionless hand, while a team of the nation's top specialists quietly confirmed there was nothing more they could do. The room smelled of antiseptic and defeat. And then, from the corner of the waiting area just beyond the glass, a black single dad in his early 40s wearing a worn jacket and work boots stood up and walked toward the door. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a specialist. He was just a maintenance worker who had come to fix a sound system and had ended up seeing something no one else in that building had thought to look for. In the next few minutes, he would do what none of them could. The charity gala at St. Catherine's Hospital had been running smoothly for most of the evening. The ballroom on the ground floor had been converted into something resembling elegance: white tablecloths, soft lighting, a string quartet near the entrance. Donors in tailored suits and designer dresses moved between tables, writing checks with the quiet satisfaction of people who believed money could fix most things. James Holloway had been there since 4 in the afternoon, crouched behind a speaker column near the back wall, rerouting an audio cable that the venue's regular technician had installed incorrectly. He wasn't a guest. He was the man nobody looked at twice. James was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had learned to stay neutral in rooms where he didn't belong. He worked maintenance for the hospital, the sort of job that paid steadily enough to keep the lights on and his daughter fed. His 7-year-old Nora had come with him that evening because the after-school program had closed early and he hadn't been able to reach the neighbor who sometimes watched her. She sat in a folding chair near the service entrance, shoes dangling above the floor, working through a coloring book with the focused intensity only children can manage in noisy rooms. Nobody at that gala would have guessed that James had once worked under conditions far more chaotic than a malfunctioning sound system. 2 tours overseas as a combat medic had taught him to read situations quickly, to notice what didn't fit, to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. He had returned home with a steady pair of hands and a mind that cataloged details automatically, even when he didn't want it to. He had tried in the years since leaving the service to let that part of himself go quiet. After his wife Renee died 3 years ago, it had become easier to simply stop engaging with medicine, with hospitals, with the version of himself that believed intervention was ever worth the cost. He hadn't been back inside a treatment room since the day he signed Renee's death certificate. Diane Whitfield arrived at the gala the way she arrived everywhere, slightly late, instantly noticed. She was 45, with dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested control rather than vanity. The founder of Whitfield Capital, one of the most influential private investment firms on the East Coast, she had built her empire through a combination of genuine intelligence and an absolute refusal to be underestimated. She had been the evening's headline donor, having pledged a significant sum toward the hospital's pediatric cardiac unit, an irony that would not become apparent until later. Beside her walked Theo, her 8-year-old son, dressed in a small blazer he clearly found uncomfortable, tugging at the collar as they crossed the room. Theo was the one constant in a life that had otherwise been rebuilt from scratch after her divorce 3 years ago. He was bright, curious, prone to asking questions at inconvenient moments, and he was in every way that mattered the reason she got out of bed each morning. The evening proceeded without incident for nearly 2 hours. James finished the cable work and had settled into a chair near the service corridor to wait out the remainder of the event before packing up. Nora had fallen into a light sleep against his shoulder. Then a small commotion near the entrance caused a brief surge in the crowd, the kind that happens when a late arrival creates a bottleneck at the door. In the movement, Theo was jostled and caught a glancing impact against his chest from the elbow of a man stepping sideways to avoid the crowd. It wasn't hard. Theo winced, pressed his hand briefly to his sternum, and looked up at his mother with the uncertain expression of a child deciding whether something is worth crying about. Diane touched his shoulder and asked if he was okay. He said yes. She believed him. 4 minutes later, Theo's face went pale. Not gradually, all at once, like a light being adjusted. He blinked slowly, reached for his mother's arm, and then his body simply gave out. The chair scraped backward as Diane caught him. He was unconscious before he reached her lap, his lips faintly blue, his breathing shallow and irregular, the nearest guests lurching backward. The room transformed in seconds. Within 6 minutes, Theo was on a gurney being moved to the private care wing. The initial read was confident. Anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction possibly triggered by something he'd eaten. The team moved through the protocol with practiced efficiency. Epinephrine, airway management, IV fluids. Diane was ushered into the corridor and told the team was handling it. James had watched all of it from 30 feet away. He hadn't moved during the initial panic, partly because Nora had startled awake and he needed a moment to settle her. He watched the gurney disappear through the corridor doors. He sat with Nora until she drifted back to sleep, and then stayed in his chair because the equipment still needed to be packed. An hour passed. Through the glass panel beside the corridor doors, he could see the edge of the private care wing, not the room itself, but enough of the hallway to catch movement. He wasn't watching deliberately, he just noticed things. He always had. It was when a second cart was wheeled in, this one carrying a crash unit, not a standard treatment trolley, that something shifted in his attention. He stood without fully deciding to, and moved toward the glass. Through the narrow window, he could see the monitors above Theo's bed. He could see the team working, still running the anaphylaxis protocol, escalating it. More epinephrine, more aggressive fluid management. James looked at the boy's skin. No hives, no swelling around the face or throat. The lips still faintly blue, but no visible edema, none of the external markers that almost always accompanied a true anaphylactic event in a child. He looked at the cardiac monitor. Even from his distance, the waveform was visible enough for his eyes to find what trained eyes inside the room had not yet stopped to look for. The T-wave pattern was wrong, not the wrong of a body in allergic shock, the wrong of a heart misfiring at the electrical level. He had seen that pattern before, not in a hospital, in a field kit on a dirt road overseas, bent over a 23-year-old soldier whose heart had decided at precisely the wrong moment in its electrical cycle that it was done. Commotio cordis, a disruption triggered not by force but by timing, a blunt impact landing in that narrow window of vulnerability between heartbeats. In a child with an undetected structural defect in the cardiac wall, the kind that caused no symptoms until a specific trigger found it, the result could look exactly like this. The team inside was treating the wrong condition. Every dose of epinephrine was stimulating a heart that needed to be slowed and stabilized, not pushed. James stood at the glass for a long moment. His hands were still, but something behind his eyes was moving fast, weighing, calculating, dragging up memories he had spent 3 years trying to bury. The last time he had been certain about something medical, he had said nothing. He had deferred to the doctors, told himself they knew more than he did, told himself it wasn't his place. He had signed the certificate 7 days later. Nora shifted in her chair behind him, small and asleep. He looked back at her. He thought about what it would mean to walk through that door, the resistance he would face, the way he would look. A man in work boots and a worn jacket, telling a team of specialists they were killing the patient they were trying to save. He thought about how that story ended, usually. He thought about Renee. Then he turned back to the glass, looked at the boy on the other side of it, and walked to the door. He pushed it open before he could talk himself out of it. The lead physician, Dr. Aldridge, looked up from the bedside with the sharp expression of someone accustomed to being interrupted by the wrong people. Diane straightened at the sight of him. James said clearly and without preamble, "You're treating the wrong condition." The nurse was already moving toward the door to summon security. Diane stepped forward. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" James didn't look at her. He looked at Aldridge, because Aldridge was the only person in the room whose next decision would matter. "I know how this looks. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at his T-wave on that monitor and tell me what you see." Security arrived in the doorway. Dr. Aldridge raised one hand slightly, not to James but to the guard, in the reflexive gesture of a man who needed 2 more seconds to think. He looked at the monitor. The waveform sat there, quiet and damning, tracing the same aberrant pattern it had been tracing for the past hour while everyone in the room watched everything else. 7 seconds. James counted them. Then Aldridge turned back to the room, with the expression of a man who had just found something he didn't want to find. "Hold the next dose," he said. He looked at James. "What condition are you treating?" James told him. "The T-wave anomaly, the absence of hives or edema, the chest impact 40 minutes before Theo collapsed, the narrow electrical window that made commotio cordis possible, the likelihood of an underlying structural defect that had never announced itself until now." He used the language correctly because he had spent years earning the right to use it, even if nothing about him in that room suggested it. Aldridge listened without interrupting, which was itself a form of answer. When James finished, Aldridge turned to the team. "I want an echo. Now." and someone get cardiology on the phone. Diane stepped directly into Aldridge's path. Someone needs to tell me who this man is and why he just changed my son's treatment plan. Aldridge met her eyes steadily. Miss Whitfield, right now I need you to let us work. She didn't move immediately. She looked at James, really looked at him, the worn jacket, the complete absence of any credential or affiliation that would explain his presence, and something in her expression moved between fury and something harder to name. Then she stepped aside, not because she trusted what was happening, but because the alternative was to keep fighting in a room where her son's heart was beating wrong. The echocardiogram technician arrived within 4 minutes, the cardiology fellow 90 seconds after that. James stayed near the wall, watching the monitor with the focused quiet of a man who had learned that the most useful thing you could sometimes do was simply not leave. The echo took 11 minutes. When the images resolved on the screen, the cardiology fellow leaned in close, then straightened, then leaned in again. He pointed to something in the lower portion of the image, a structural irregularity along the atrioventricular wall, small, congenital, the kind of thing that produced no symptoms under ordinary conditions and would never have appeared on a routine pediatric checkup. Under ordinary conditions, Theo could have lived another decade without knowing it was there. Under the specific conditions of that evening, a low-impact blow to the chest landing at precisely the wrong moment in his cardiac cycle, in a boy whose heart had a hidden architectural weakness, it had been enough. Aldridge ordered the protocol shift, beta blocker to stabilize the electrical activity, cardioversion to coax the rhythm back toward normal, the epinephrine abandoned entirely. 8 minutes after the new protocol began, Theo's heart rate started to even out, not dramatically. Gradually, number by number, each increment small enough that you had to watch carefully to believe it was real. The blue tinge at his lips faded by degrees. That night James stood in the hallway outside the cardiac unit under fluorescent lights and told Diane about Renee. He told her about the months of misdiagnosis, the symptoms that accumulated in a pattern he had recognized but couldn't name with the authority the doctors required, about the evening he had sat across a desk from a physician and said carefully that he thought they were missing something, and the way the physician had listened politely before explaining that James's military medical training was not equivalent to a clinical differential diagnosis, about going home that night and telling himself the doctor was right. Renee had died 7 days later of a cardiac complication that a different imaging angle might have found in time. "You're telling me this," Diane said finally, "so that I understand why you're certain." "I'm telling you this," James said, "so that you understand what it cost me the last time I wasn't." At 11:47 that night, the monitors in Theo's room triggered a cascade alert. His oxygen saturation dropped 14 points in under a minute. The structural defect was progressing faster than anticipated. The on-call cardiologist was making emergency calls to the attending surgeon, trying to determine whether Theo could be stabilized enough to survive a procedure. James was not in the hospital when the alert fired. He was in the parking garage, sitting in his truck with the engine off. He had come back after dropping Nora at the neighbor's, not entirely sure why. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes. He turned his phone on at midnight, sat in the silence a moment longer, then got out of the truck. 20 minutes later, Diane came through the interior doors at a pace that wasn't quite running. She had been told James Holloway was sitting in the lobby and had come down immediately, because in that moment, with her son's monitors alarming upstairs, James Holloway in the lobby was the most useful piece of information she had received all night. "He's crashing again," she said, her voice flat in the way of someone past the register where panic is loud. "It's worse than last night. They can't stabilize him." James stood. She told him everything. The cascade alert, the destabilizing rhythm, the progressing defect. When she finished, James said, "The echo last night, was it a standard apical 4-chamber view?" She didn't know what that meant. He explained. A modified subcostal oblique approach gave a different angle on the atrioventricular junction. There might be a secondary occlusion point the first imaging hadn't reached. In the field, that modified view was sometimes the only way to find what they were missing. "Why didn't you push for this last night?" "Because I wasn't certain it was necessary until now," he said, "and because saying it means explaining how I know it, and that's a conversation I wasn't ready to have." Diane walked directly to Dr. Okafor, the attending cardiologist, and said, "There's a man outside this unit who served as a combat medic and believes there is a secondary occlusion point in my son's defect that your current imaging hasn't identified. If he's wrong, you've lost 4 minutes. If he's right, you found what you're missing. I am asking you to make that calculation." Dr. Okafor made it. James came in and described the modified subcostal oblique approach to the echo technician in precise, unambiguous terms. The technician repositioned her equipment and adjusted the probe angle, while James guided her with the directional precision that comes from physical memory. The image resolved on the screen at 1:23 in the morning, a secondary narrowing at the oblique margin of the defect, invisible from the standard angle, sitting in the precise location generating the occlusion driving Theo's deteriorating rhythm. Dr. Okafor looked at it for 3 seconds. "Get Dr. Walsh on the phone. Tell him we have a target." Theo came through the procedure at 4:12 in the morning. The defect had been repaired with a small catheter-deployed closure device. Barring complications, which were considered unlikely given the precision of the repair, her son would recover fully and live a completely normal life. Diane sat down next to James in the hallway and said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you." 2 words, not decorated, not cushioned inside a longer sentence, just the words themselves, from a woman who had spent most of her adult life keeping gratitude at a professional distance, and who was no longer doing that. In the weeks that followed, Diane used the full weight of Whitfield Capital's influence to push St. Catherine's and 2 affiliated institutions to adopt a mandatory cardiac screening protocol targeting the class of congenital defects that had gone undetected in Theo. She worked with Dr. Aldridge and Dr. Okafor to formalize James's modified imaging technique into the hospital's standard diagnostic training. She did it without press releases or public announcements. She just made it happen. James was informed through a brief letter from the hospital's chief medical officer confirming that no further action would be taken by the inquiry board. When Theo was well enough to have visitors, he had made a drawing of 2 figures, one in a white coat and one in regular clothes. He had colored the figure in regular clothes slightly larger. James took it home and put it on the refrigerator. That evening, after Nora was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet and thought about Renee, not with the old weight, with tenderness, with the ordinary ache of absence rather than the sharp edge of a wound. He thought about the night she died, and the night Theo almost did, and the difference between them, not in the outcome, but in the choice he had made. The second time he had spoken, that was all. He had walked through a door and said what he knew to be true and refused to be quiet about it, regardless of what it cost him. It hadn't required a credential or a title or anyone's permission. It had only required him to stop treating his own silence as a form of humility when what it actually was had always been fear. The worth of a person has never lived in their credentials. It lives in what they do when staying quiet would be easier, and when the cost of speaking is something only they will have to pay.